Breaking. The House of Lords just staged the largest rebellion in modern British history against Keir Starmer's controversial National Security Act. 217 peers defied party lines to block legislation that would have given government unprecedented surveillance powers. And what happened next triggered a constitutional standoff that threatens the Labour government's entire agenda. The very balance of power in Britain hangs by a thread. If you want to understand how this parliamentary uprising will reshape British politics forever, hit subscribe now, because this rebellion is spreading faster than Downing Street can contain. Here's what sparked this unprecedented constitutional crisis. At 4:15 p.m. yesterday, Starmer's flagship National Security Act reached its final reading in the Lords. The bill contained sweeping new powers for government agencies. These weren't ordinary security measures, they were fundamental changes to civil liberties. The legislation would enable ministers to access private communications without judicial oversight. Government officials could monitor financial transactions without warrants. And most controversially, the Home Secretary could designate areas of special concern where normal constitutional protections wouldn't apply. Labour whips expected the usual token resistance. But something extraordinary happened instead. Crossbench peers, typically cautious and divided, united in opposition. Conservative Lords abandoned traditional deference to security legislation. And most shockingly, 42 Labour peers broke ranks to vote against their own government. When Lord Falconer, former Lord Chancellor under Tony Blair, rose to speak against the bill, the chamber fell silent. His exact words sent shockwaves through Westminster. "I cannot in good conscience support legislation that so fundamentally undermines the constitutional protections I spent my career defending. This bill crosses a line no democratic government should approach." His voice trembled with emotion as he continued, "Today I must choose between party loyalty and the oath I swore to this chamber. I choose the latter." The government benches froze in visible shock. Minister Baroness Williams attempted to intervene, but crossbench peers shouted, "Hear him! Hear him!" drowning out her objections. Lord Falconer's betrayal was just the beginning. One after another, distinguished legal minds from all parties rose to condemn specific provisions. Former Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption methodically dismantled the bill's surveillance provisions, calling them incompatible with 800 years of English legal tradition since Magna Carta. When the government tried to force closure of debate at 7:30 p.m, the Lords erupted in unprecedented disorder. The Lord Speaker struggled to maintain control as peers shouted shame and division. Finally, at 8:47 p.m, the vote was called. The electronic tally board showed the devastating result. 217 against, 98 for government. Ministers sat ashen-faced as the rebellion scale became clear. The bill wasn't just defeated, it was destroyed. Within minutes, frantic messages flew between the Lords and Downing Street. The PM's chief legislative advisor was seen running, literally running, through Parliament's corridors toward the government offices. Constitutional experts immediately recognised the significance. No government had suffered such a decisive Lords defeat on security legislation in modern times. Meanwhile, ordinary British citizens who value their traditional liberties are celebrating this rare victory for constitutional checks and balances. Richard Thompson, a 72-year-old retired solicitor from Devon, organised a spontaneous gathering outside the Houses of Parliament. His homemade sign reading, "Thank God for the Lords," was photographed and shared millions of times online. "I've never been one for the unelected chamber," Thompson told reporters. "But today they stood up for the British people when our elected officials wouldn't." His sentiment reflects a growing national mood. While government ministers insist the legislation is essential for national security, leaked Cabinet Office assessments reveal it would collect data on an estimated 17 million innocent citizens annually. The contrast is so stark, so fundamentally troubling that even traditional Labour supporters are questioning the government's intentions. Margaret Williams, 68, a Labour Party member for 40 years, told the BBC, "This isn't what we elected them for. My parents lived through a war to protect our freedoms, not to see them given away by our own side." Her interview has been viewed 3.7 million times since yesterday evening. While ministers enjoy unprecedented executive power, ordinary citizens face the prospect of surveillance without warrant or judicial review. Veterans groups have been particularly vocal, with the British Legion issuing an unprecedented political statement. Those who served didn't. Fight for a Britain where citizens are treated as suspects. Meanwhile, at an exclusive London restaurant last night, ministerial special advisors were overheard laughing about antiquated notions of privacy and dismissing public concerns as security illiteracy. The disconnect between government elites and ordinary citizens couldn't be more pronounced. Then something unprecedented happened that nobody saw coming. At 10:30 a.m. today, Baroness Chakrabarti, former director of Liberty and Labour peer, broke ranks completely by releasing confidential government impact assessments. Standing on the steps of Parliament, surrounded by journalists and flanked by peers from 5 different parties, she shattered all parliamentary convention. When the government deliberately withholds critical information from Parliament to force through legislation, the constitutional contract is broken, she declared with quiet determination. These documents reveal the bill's true scope and purpose. The documents she displayed showed the Home Office's own legal advisers had warned ministers that key provisions were likely incompatible with human rights obligations and constitutionally problematic. Most explosively, one document explicitly acknowledged the legislation would fundamentally alter the relationship between citizen and state and circumvent established judicial safeguards. Palace sources reveal the king himself expressed deep private concern about the legislation during his weekly audience with the Prime Minister, while maintaining constitutional propriety. The palace let it be known through careful channels that the monarchy was attentive to matters affecting long-established constitutional balances. The optics are catastrophic for Starmer. While he pushes unprecedented executive power, both the Lords and the monarchy stand as defenders of traditional British liberties. Constitutional expert Professor Richard Harrington of Oxford called the rebellion the most significant reassertion of the Lords' constitutional role since the Parliament Acts. Former Home Secretaries from both parties released a joint statement expressing grave reservations about specific provisions, further isolating current leadership. The Archbishop of Canterbury added his voice, calling for legislation that respects the dignity and privacy of every citizen. Government whips were reportedly blindsided by this moral authority response, having prepared only for partisan attacks, not a unified front of institutional condemnation spanning Lords, Church, monarchy, and former ministers from across the political spectrum. The political impact was immediate and severe. The pound strengthened 1.2% against the dollar as markets reacted positively to the constitutional check on executive power. But inside Westminster, absolute chaos has erupted. Cabinet unity fractured instantly. 3 junior ministers privately expressed relief at the Lords' intervention. Justice. Minister Sarah Reynolds was overheard telling colleagues the bill went too far, but she couldn't say so publicly. Government WhatsApp messages leaked to The Guardian reveal panic at the highest levels. "We're completely exposed," wrote one senior advisor. "The PM pushed too hard and now we've got Lords, judges and half our backbenchers in open revolt." The international reaction was equally damaging. The Council of Europe issued a statement expressing concern about proposed surveillance powers incompatible with European democratic standards. American legislators from both parties questioned whether British intelligence sharing would require new safeguards if the legislation eventually passed. The UN Special Rapporteur on Privacy released a blistering assessment, calling the bill among the most intrusive surveillance regimes proposed by any Western democracy. Social media erupted with unprecedented support for the unelected chamber. Hashtags like #Lords Defend Freedom and #Thank You Peers trended globally for 18 consecutive hours. YouGov polling showed stunning reversal in public opinion. 67% of respondents now approved of the Lords' action, including 54% of Labour voters. Parliamentary arithmetic suddenly looks disastrous for the government. At least 47 Labour MPs have privately indicated they can no longer support the bill if the government attempts to override the Lords. Conservative opposition has solidified completely, with even security hawks backing away from the legislation. The SNP announced they would oppose any attempt to reintroduce the measure, calling it English authoritarianism at its worst. The parliamentary math simply doesn't add up for Starmer anymore. Street demonstrations supporting the Lords have erupted in 23 cities across Britain. Outside the Royal Courts of Justice, legal professionals gathered in unprecedented numbers, many wearing formal court attire as a symbol of their constitutional concerns. The Bar Council and Law Society issued a joint statement calling certain provisions fundamentally incompatible with rule of law principles. The Police Federation released a carefully worded statement expressing officers' discomfort with implementing certain powers without judicial oversight. Even former intelligence officials have spoken out, with ex-MI5 Director Jonathan Evans warning that effective security requires public consent and judicial oversight. Inside Downing Street, absolute pandemonium has erupted. Ministers are refusing to defend the bill in media appearances, creating a vacuum filled by critics. The Attorney General has reportedly warned the Prime Minister that certain provisions might trigger judicial review if forced through Parliament. Cabinet Secretary Simon Jenkins was overheard saying, "This has become politically radioactive. Nobody wants their fingerprints on it now." WhatsApp groups with names like Damage Limitation and Recovery Strategy are buzzing with panicked messages. The question isn't if they'll retreat, it's how to do so while saving face. Starmer looked shell-shocked and isolated during Wednesday's emergency cabinet meeting. Sources say he barely spoke while ministers argued around him. Senior civil servants have privately expressed profound relief at the Lords' intervention, with one permanent secretary telling colleagues, "They've saved us from ourselves." Labour's chief whip has reportedly lost control of the parliamentary party, with MPs openly discussing whether the legislation reflects true Labour values. Momentum, the left-wing Labour group, issued a statement praising the Lords for standing up for civil liberties when the government wouldn't. Cabinet unity has completely collapsed. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, the bill's primary champion, appears increasingly isolated. 3 special advisers have already resigned, with more departures expected hourly. Parliamentary private secretaries, the lowest ministerial rung, are jumping ship to protect their future careers. The government faces a stark choice: withdraw the legislation gracefully or face certain defeat in the Commons if they try to override the Lords. Media teams that normally coordinate messaging have fragmented, with departments issuing contradictory statements about the path forward. Veteran Labour MP Diane Abbott didn't mince words. "In 35 years in Parliament, I've never seen a government so thoroughly outmanoeuvred on its own legislation." But here's the twist that could destroy Starmer's leadership permanently. Leaked Cabinet Office documents show this wasn't about national security at all. The legislation was designed primarily for economic surveillance and protest suppression. The documents, verified by 3 independent sources and published by The Times at 5:30 a.m. today, reveal internal discussions where ministers explicitly discussed using terrorism powers against economic disruptors and climate activism. One document outlines plans to monitor financial nonconformity, essentially tracking citizens who reduce their participation in the digital economy. Another discusses applying surveillance powers to identify protest organisers and online influence networks. If these documents are authentic, and all evidence suggests they are, then ministers deliberately misled Parliament about the legislation's true purpose. This wasn't about protecting Britain from terrorism. It was about expanding government control over political and economic activity. Think about what that means. While publicly claiming these powers were needed to fight terrorism, ministers were privately planning to use them against legitimate democratic activities like protests and economic choices. The optics of that are absolutely devastating, not just political overreach, but fundamental dishonesty about threats to democracy itself. According to sources within the civil service, senior officials repeatedly warned ministers about scope, creep, and potential misuse of the proposed powers. The documents allegedly contain margin notes from legal advisors highlighting serious ECHR concerns that were subsequently ignored in the final draft. One senior civil servant reportedly told colleagues, "This goes beyond politics. This threatens the constitutional settlement itself. Britain stands on the precipice of a governance crisis that could permanently reshape the relationship between Parliament, government and the Lords." Meanwhile, opposition parties are executing masterful political strategies. While Labour implodes, both Liberal Democrats and Greens are positioning themselves as the true defenders of civil liberties. Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey declared yesterday, "When Labour abandons its commitment to human rights, we will stand firm." The contrast couldn't be more striking. A government in disarray versus principled opposition. The polls tell the dramatic story. Labour's approval rating has plummeted from 48% to 37% in just 3 days. Liberal Democrat support has surged to 14%, their highest level in a decade. Most concerning for Starmer, detailed polling shows collapse in support among university-educated urban voters, the demographic that delivered his victory. Liberal Democrats are already selecting candidates for key Labour seats, sensing vulnerability for the first time since the election. In university towns and metropolitan constituencies, Labour MPs report constituency offices flooded with messages of concern. Political historians call this the most significant realignment of progressive politics since the Iraq War divided the left. At 11:30 a.m. today, a cross-party group of 56 MPs announced the formation of a new Digital Rights and Civil Liberties Caucus, a direct challenge to the government's security approach. This unprecedented coalition includes Labour backbenchers, signalling the depth of internal party division. For the first time since taking office, Starmer faces questions about his grip on power. Shadow cabinet elections, normally a formality, suddenly look potentially competitive as challengers sense weakness. Labour's membership has reportedly decreased by 7,000 inches, just 72 hours, as lifelong supporters express disillusionment. One Labour strategist was overheard in Parliament's cafeteria. "We've handed the Liberals an issue they can beat us with for the next decade. The next 48 hours are absolutely critical for Britain's constitutional future." The government faces 3 unpalatable options: withdraw the legislation entirely, substantially amend it to meet Lords' concerns, or attempt to force it through using the Parliament Act, a nuclear option that would trigger backbench rebellion. The balance between security and liberty hangs in the balance. Judicial review applications are already being prepared by rights organisations. The question is no longer whether the legislation will pass in its current form. It won't. It's whether Starmer's authority can survive such a public defeat. Britain is witnessing a rare moment when an unelected chamber successfully checked executive overreach. This crisis will be studied for generations as a critical test of Britain's constitutional safeguards. At its centre stands a Prime Minister who miscalculated both the legislation's reception and his own authority to force it through. Not since Tony Blair's defeat on 90-day detention has security legislation been so thoroughly rejected. Constitutional experts warn this could permanently weaken Starmer's ability to navigate controversial legislation through Parliament. The Lords have reasserted their constitutional role as a check on executive power in a way not seen for decades. Financial markets have actually welcomed the development, seeing constitutional stability in the functioning of checks and balances. And ordinary Britons are left pondering a remarkable irony that an unelected chamber ultimately protected democratic freedoms when the elected one would not. As parliamentary debates continue and public opinion solidifies against the legislation, Britain stands at a crossroads of security policy that will define Starmer's premiership. So here's the question that matters. Did the House of Lords save British democracy or overstep their constitutional role? Did Starmer genuinely believe these powers were necessary, or was this always about expanding government control? And could this rebellion spread to other controversial legislation on the government's agenda? What do you think? Is this a victory for constitutional checks and balances, or an unelected chamber thwarting the democratic will? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story shocked you as much as it shocked us, share it with everyone who needs to see what's really happening in Westminster right now. The mainstream media won't tell you the full implications of this constitutional showdown, but we, will. Next week, we'll reveal exclusive recordings from the emergency cabinet meeting where ministers realised their flagship legislation was collapsing. You won't believe what the Prime Minister said when he thought the microphones were off.